Welcome to the story of the man who was buried alive. I am your host, Holmes's friend, Dr. Watson. Thank you for joining me on another journey. But before we start, let me know, from which city are you watching from, and what was the first Sherlock Holmes story you ever heard about? Chapter 1, The Knocking Beneath the Earth. In the long and varied catalogue of cases that I have had the privilege of chronicling during my years at the side of Sherlock Holmes, there are some that tested his intellect, others that tested his courage, and a rare few that tested both in equal measure. But of all the mysteries we encountered together, there is one that I have hesitated to set down in writing, not because the facts are unclear to me, but because even now, years later, the memory of it stirs something deeply unsettling in my chest. It is the case I have come to think of as the man who was buried alive, and it began, as so many of our strangest adventures did, with an unexpected visitor at 221B Baker Street. It was a bitter evening in late November of 1894. A hard rain had been hammering the windows since midday, and the fire in the sitting room burned low, casting long and restless shadows across the walls. Holmes sat in his armchair with his eyes half closed, and his fingers steepled beneath his chin, lost in one of those deep and private meditations that I had long since learned not to interrupt. I occupied the opposite chair with a medical journal open across my knee, though I confess I had read the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing a single word. The world outside was dark and wet and miserable, and there seemed little reason to expect anything more from the evening than silence and the steady drumming of the rain. It was just past 9 o'clock when we heard the front door open below, followed by a frantic exchange of voices, one belonging to Mrs. Hudson, the other to a man I did not recognize. His tone was high and strained, the voice of someone balanced on the thinnest edge of composure. Moments later, heavy and uneven footsteps ascended the stairs, and the door to our sitting room was thrown open without so much as a knock. The man who stood on our threshold was soaked to the bone. Water dripped from the brim of his hat and pooled on the floorboards at his feet. He was perhaps 60 years of age, broad-shouldered but stooped, with a weathered face that spoke of a life lived largely out of doors. His hands trembled visibly, and his eyes, wide and ringed with exhaustion, darted between Holmes and myself with an expression of raw and desperate fear. "Forgive me, sirs," he said, his voice cracking. "Forgive me for coming like this, but I didn't know where else to go. The police, they looked at me as though I'd gone mad. And perhaps I have. Perhaps I have." Holmes's eyes opened fully. He regarded the man with that sharp and penetrating gaze I knew so well, the gaze that could take the measure of a stranger in a single glance. "You have not gone mad," Holmes said evenly. "You are a cemetery groundskeeper, I observe. Highgate, if I am not mistaken. You have walked here rather than taken a cab, which tells me you are a man of modest means who did not wish to waste money on a fare. Yet the urgency of your visit compelled you to come in spite of the weather. You have something on your hands that you have tried and failed to scrub away. It is not dirt, it is fear." The man staggered slightly, as though the accuracy of these observations had struck him like a physical blow. "My name is Albert Cowell, sir. I am the night caretaker at Highgate Cemetery, the western ground. I've held the post for 11 years, and in all that time I have never once been troubled by the dead." He paused and swallowed hard. "Until 2 nights ago." Holmes gestured toward the basket chair near the fire. "Sit down, Mr. Cowell." "Watson, pour the man a brandy. He has had a considerable shock, and I suspect the worst of it is still to come." I did as Holmes asked. Cowell accepted the glass with both hands and drank deeply before he spoke again. The colour began to return to his face, though his fingers still shook against the glass. 2 nights past, he began, I was making my rounds through the western section. It was late, past midnight, I should say. The rain had let up for a spell and the ground was soft and quiet. I passed by the newer plots where a burial had taken place that very afternoon. A gentleman of some standing, I was told. Sir Reginald Ashcroft, a banker, fine coffin, polished brass, the sort of funeral where even the flowers seem to cost more than a working man earns in a month. He paused and stared into the fire. I was perhaps 10 yards from the grave when I heard it. A sound, faint at first, like the tapping of a branch against a window. But there were no trees near that plot, Mr. Holmes. Nothing that could have made such a noise. I stopped and listened, and then it came again, louder, more insistent. "Knocking," Holmes said quietly. Cowell nodded, and I saw that the memory alone was enough to drain the colour from his cheeks all over again. "Knocking, sir, from beneath the earth. Slow at first, then faster, frantic, you might say, like a man pounding on a door that will not open. I stood there frozen. I could not move, I could not breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The room was very still. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. I ran, Cowell admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. God help me. I ran. I went straight to the police station on Swains Lane and told them what I'd heard. They sent 2 constables back with me at first light. We dug down to the coffin and pried open the lid and what we found inside. He could not finish the sentence. His jaw worked uselessly, and the glass trembled so violently in his grip that I feared it would shatter. Holmes leaned forward. His expression had not changed, but I recognized the quality of his attention, that absolute and consuming focus that only the most extraordinary problems could produce. "Tell me precisely what you saw, Mr. Cowell. Every detail. Leave nothing out." Cowell drew a shuddering breath. The man inside, Sir Reginald, he was dead. There was no question of that. His face was twisted into an expression I shall carry with me to my own grave. His mouth was open, frozen in what must have been a scream. And his hands... He held up his own hands as though to demonstrate, then lowered them again. His fingers were torn and bloodied, Mr. Holmes. The nails were cracked and broken, and the underside of the coffin lid, it was scratched. Deep scratches, sir, gouged into the wood as though he had clawed at it with every ounce of strength he possessed. I felt a cold sensation creep along the back of my neck. As a medical man, I was no stranger to death in its many forms, but the image Cowell described, a man waking in the suffocating darkness of his own coffin, clawing at the lid above him with the desperate and futile hope of escape, was enough to unsettle even the steadiest nerves. "The police," I said. "What was their conclusion?" "They called it a dreadful medical error, sir. They said the doctor must have declared him dead when he was only in some sort of deep sleep. A cataleptic fit, one of them called it. They said it was tragic but not criminal. They took their notes and left." "And you?" Holmes asked. You do not share their conclusion." Cowell looked at Holmes with something close to anguish. "I don't know what I believe, Mr. Holmes, but there is something I did not tell the police, something I was too frightened to mention, for fear they would think me a drunkard or a liar." Holmes waited. "The night before I heard the knocking. The night after the burial, I saw someone at the grave, a man, standing in the darkness. He did not carry a lantern. He did not move. He simply stood there, beside the fresh earth, as though he were waiting for something. I watched him for perhaps 20 minutes from the shelter of the chapel wall. Then a carriage passed along the road beyond the gates, and when I looked again, he was gone." Holmes rose from his chair with a suddenness that startled both Cowell and myself. "Watson," he said, and there was a quality in his voice that I had heard only in the presence of the most exceptional cases, a controlled excitement, a sharpening of every faculty. "Fetch your coat and your revolver. Mr. Cowell, you will take us to this grave tonight." "Tonight, sir?" Cowell looked stricken. "In this weather?" The weather is our ally, Mr. Cowell. Rain discourages the curious and preserves the evidence. Besides, he paused at the mantelpiece and reached for his pipe, though he did not light it. A man does not stand vigil over a grave in the dead of night without purpose, and when the knocking came the following evening, whoever that figure was did not return to answer it. He turned to face us both, and in the firelight his features had taken on that hawk-like intensity I had seen 100 times before, the expression of a hunter who has caught the first faint scent of his quarry. This is not a medical error, Watson. I'm quite certain of that. A man was buried alive, yes, but the question that interests me is not how he came to be in that coffin. His eyes narrowed. The question is why. Within the quarter hour, we were in a hansom cab rattling northward through the rain-swept streets toward Highgate. Cowell sat across from us, clutching the seat with white-knuckled hands, while Holmes stared out of the window in perfect silence, his reflection ghosting across the wet glass. I knew that expression well enough to understand that his mind was already at work, turning the fragments of Cowell's story over and over, searching for the edges that did not quite fit. For my own part, I confess I found it difficult to think of anything beyond the image of that scratched coffin lid. I had read accounts of premature burial in the medical literature, isolated and ghastly cases that haunted the profession like a recurring nightmare. But those were errors born of ignorance or haste, tragedies of an imperfect science. Something in Holmes's manner told me that what awaited us at Highgate was a different matter entirely. The cemetery gates were locked when we arrived, but Cowell produced a heavy iron key and led us through. The rain had eased to a fine mist that hung among the headstones like gauze, and the great stone monuments of the western ground loomed on either side of the path like the ruins of some forgotten city. Our lantern cast a small and wavering circle of light, and beyond it the darkness was absolute. Cowell stopped at a plot near the eastern wall. The earth here had been recently disturbed, dug up by the constables and only partially refilled. A mound of dark soil stood beside the open pit, and the coffin, its lid removed and leaning against a nearby stone, lay exposed at the bottom. Holmes descended into the grave without hesitation. He crouched beside the coffin and held his lantern close, examining every inch of the interior with the focused precision of a surgeon. I watched from above as his gloved fingers traced the scratches on the underside of the lid, pausing here and there, measuring their depth with a pocket rule he produced from his coat. "Watson," he called up softly, "come down here. I want your medical opinion." I lowered myself into the pit, no easy task in the mud, and knelt beside him. The coffin was lined in white satin, now stained with dark smears of blood. The scratches on the lid were exactly as Cowell had described, deep, desperate gouges, radiating outward from the centre in frantic arcs. "What do you observe?" Holmes asked. "A man regaining consciousness in a sealed coffin, clawing at the lid in a state of absolute terror," I said. "The injuries to the fingers are consistent with prolonged and violent effort against a hard surface." "And the soil on his clothing?" I looked more carefully. The body had already been removed to the mortuary, but traces remained on the satin lining. I frowned. There is remarkably little. If the coffin had been improperly sealed, or if soil had sifted in during the burial, I would expect far more. "Precisely," Holmes murmured. He held the lantern closer to the scratches. "And these marks, look at the depth and force of them. These were not made by a man weakened by hours of oxygen deprivation, Watson. These were made by a man at full strength, a man who was fully conscious and utterly desperate from the very first moment." He fell silent for a long moment, staring at the ruined lid with an expression I could not entirely read. Then he stood and brushed the mud from his knees. "There is more to this case than a doctor's mistake," he said quietly. "Far more. I suspect that before we are finished, we shall find that the grave of Sir Reginald Ashcroft holds darker secrets than any cemetery in London was built to contain." He climbed out of the pit and turned to Cowell, who stood shivering at the edge. "Mr. Cowell, you were right to come to us. This is no ordinary tragedy." His voice carried across the misty graveyard with quiet authority. "I shall take the case, and I strongly advise you, if you see that figure at the graveside again, do not approach him. Simply note the time and send word to Baker Street at once." As we made our way back through the dark and silent grounds, I glanced over my shoulder one last time at the open grave. The lantern light had faded behind us, and the pit was swallowed by the darkness as though it had never been there at all. I did not know it then, but we had taken our first steps into one of the strangest and most harrowing investigations of Holmes's career, a case in which the dead would prove more dangerous than the living, and the truth, when it finally emerged, would be more terrible than any of us had dared to imagine. Chapter 2. Ashcroft House. The following morning broke grey and cheerless over London. The sky hung low with the promise of further rain. Holmes had risen before me, a habit that, in the early stages of a compelling case, was as reliable as the tides, and by the time I descended to the sitting-room, I found him already dressed, standing at the window with a telegram in one hand and a cup of black coffee in the other. He had not touched the breakfast Mrs. Hudson had laid out, and I knew from experience that food would hold no interest for him until the puzzle before us had begun to yield its secrets. "Ah, Watson," he said without turning, "I trust you slept well. I confess I did not sleep at all. I've been making inquiries." "At this hour?" "The hour is irrelevant when the subject is murder, or something far more peculiar than murder." He turned from the window and handed me the telegram. "I sent a wire to Inspector Lestrade at 5:30 this morning. His reply confirms what I suspected. Sir Reginald Ashcroft was a senior partner at the London Continental Bank, 61 years of age, knighted for his services to the financial industry, a man of considerable wealth and, until 3 days ago, considerable reputation." "And the cause of death?" "Heart failure, according to doctor. Our Halstead, Ashcroft's personal physician, who was conveniently present when the collapse occurred. The death certificate was signed within 2 hours of the event. The funeral was arranged with remarkable speed and took place the following afternoon. The entire affair, from death to burial, was concluded in less than 30 hours. I frowned. "That is unusually fast." "It is not merely unusual, Watson. It is suspicious." He set down his coffee and reached for his coat. "Come. We are expected at Ashcroft House within the hour. Lady Margaret, the widow, has agreed to receive us, though I suspect her hospitality will extend no further than politeness demands." Ashcroft House stood in a handsome terrace on the southern edge of Regent's Park, a broad, cream-fronted residence with tall windows and an air of quiet prosperity that seemed, on that grey morning, faintly at odds with the black wreath that hung upon its door. A footman admitted us and led us through a marble-floored entrance hall to a drawing-room at the rear of the house, where we were asked to wait. Holmes did not sit. He moved through the room with the silent, purposeful attention of a man reading a book only he could see. His eyes swept across the furnishings, the mantelpiece, the writing desk near the window. He paused before a tall oak bookcase and tilted his head slightly, then moved on to the fireplace, where he crouched and examined something on the hearthstone that I could not discern from where I stood. "Holmes," I said quietly, "what are you looking for?" "I am looking for the things that should be here and are not," he replied, straightening, "and for the things that are here and should not be." Before I could press him further, the door opened and a woman entered. Lady Margaret Ashcroft was perhaps 35, slender and composed, dressed in full mourning. Her face was pale but controlled, her dark eyes watchful. She moved with the practised grace of a woman accustomed to being observed, and she regarded Holmes and myself with a cool and measuring gaze that struck me as more guarded than grieving. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." Her voice was steady and carefully modulated. "I understand you have taken an interest in my husband's death. I must say, I am not entirely certain what you hope to find. The police have already concluded their inquiries." "The police have concluded that your husband was buried alive as the result of a medical error," Holmes said pleasantly. "I have concluded nothing as yet, which is precisely why I am here. May I offer my condolences, Lady Ashcroft? I shall endeavour to take as little of your time as possible." She inclined her head and gestured toward the settee. "Ask your questions, Mr. Holmes. I have nothing to hide." It was, I thought, an oddly defensive thing to say to a man who had not yet accused her of anything. Holmes settled himself in a chair opposite her and crossed his legs. "When did you last see your husband alive, Lady Ashcroft?" "On the evening of his death. We dined together at 7. He seemed perfectly well, perhaps a touch distracted, but that was not unusual. Reginald was often preoccupied with matters of business." "And after dinner?" "He retired to his study. He told me he was expecting a visitor, his business partner, Mr. Lionel Graves, and I went upstairs at 8:30. When I came down again at 10 o'clock, Dr. Halstead was already in the house. He told me Reginald had collapsed and that he was gone." "Dr. Halstead was summoned by Mr. Graves." "I believe so, yes." "And Mr. Graves himself, was he still present when you came downstairs?" "He was in the entrance hall. He appeared very shaken. He told me he had been with Reginald when the collapse occurred and had sent for the doctor immediately." Holmes nodded slowly. "I should like to see your husband's study, Lady Ashcroft, if you would permit it." Something flickered behind her eyes, a brief and almost imperceptible hesitation, before she rose and led us down a corridor to a heavy oak door at the end of the passage. The study beyond was a large and well-appointed room, dark panelling, a broad mahogany desk, leather chairs and bookshelves that lined 3 of the 4 walls. A lamp still burned on the desk, though whether it had been left alight since the night of Ashcroft's death or recently lit, I could not say. Holmes entered the room and became for a time entirely oblivious to our presence. He circled the desk, opened drawers, examined papers, lifted objects, and set them down again. He crouched beside the wastepaper basket and sifted through its contents. He ran his fingers along the edge of a side table where 2 glasses stood, both empty, both recently washed. "2 glasses," he murmured almost to himself, "yet only one has been dried," and returned to the cabinet. "The other remains here." He moved to a small cabinet against the far wall. Its upper drawers were unlocked and contained nothing of obvious interest. Stationery, sealing wax, a bundle of receipts. But the lowest drawer was fitted with a brass lock, and when Holmes tried it, it held fast. "This drawer has been locked recently," he said, crouching to examine the keyhole. "The mechanism shows fresh scratches. Someone turned this lock in haste and not long ago. The wood around the keyhole bears a faint residue." He brought his nose close to the surface and inhaled. "Chemical, not ink, not polish." He straightened and turned to Lady Ashcroft, who stood in the doorway with her arms folded. "Do you have the key to this drawer, Lady Ashcroft?" "I do not. Reginald kept certain things private. I never questioned it." "A most trusting arrangement," Holmes observed mildly. He did not press the matter further, but I saw him make a small notation in the leather pocketbook he carried inside his coat. It was at this point that we were interrupted by the arrival of 2 further members of the household. The first was Edward Ashcroft, Sir Reginald's younger brother, a man of perhaps 50, ruddy-faced and heavy-set, who entered the study with the confident stride of someone who considered himself the natural master of every room he occupied. He wore an expensive suit that fitted him poorly, and there was about his manner an impatience that bordered on hostility. "So, you are the famous Sherlock Holmes," he said, making no effort to disguise the skepticism in his voice. "I cannot imagine what business you have here. My brother died of heart failure. It is a tragedy, not a mystery." "Tragedy and mystery are not mutually exclusive, mister." Ashcroft," Holmes replied calmly. "I understand you and your brother were not on the best of terms." Edward's colour deepened. "Who told you that?" "That is a private family matter." "The servants were good enough to mention that a heated argument took place in this very room on the night of your brother's death." Raised voices were heard clearly from the corridor. "We disagreed on a matter of business. Brothers often do. It has no bearing on what happened." "Perhaps not," Holmes said, "but I find it interesting nonetheless." Edward glared at him, but said nothing further. He crossed to the window and stood with his back to us, his jaw set in a hard line. The second arrival was a thin, nervous gentleman of middle age, who introduced himself as Lionel Graves, Sir Reginald's business partner, and the last person known to have seen him alive. Where Edward Ashcroft was blunt and combative, Graves was all anxiety and appeasement. His handshake was damp, his smile uncertain, and he had the distracted air of a man who had not slept well in some time. "A terrible business, Mr. Holmes. Terrible. I was with Reginald when it happened. We were discussing a financial matter, nothing out of the ordinary, and he simply collapsed. One moment he was speaking, the next he was on the floor. I sent for Dr. Halstead at once." "You acted commendably," Holmes said. "Tell me, Mr. Graves, how would you describe your business relationship with Sir Reginald?" Graves hesitated. "Sound. Perfectly sound. We had our disagreements, as any partners do, but nothing that could not be resolved through reasonable discussion." "And the financial health of your joint ventures?" Another hesitation, longer this time. "There have been certain pressures. The market has not been kind this year, but Reginald and I were working to stabilize the situation." Holmes regarded him with an expression of polite interest that I recognized as one of his most dangerous. "Of course," he said gently. "These things take time." Graves nodded eagerly, seemingly reassured. He did not notice that Holmes had offered no reassurance at all. When at last we took our leave of Ashcroft House, Holmes walked in silence for several minutes, his hands clasped behind his back and his brow furrowed in thought. We had reached the edge of Regent's Park before he spoke. "Well, Watson, what did you make of them?" "Lady Ashcroft struck me as remarkably composed for a woman whose husband was buried alive 3 days ago. Edward Ashcroft is angry and defensive, which may indicate guilt or simply a disagreeable temperament. And Graves is frightened of something." "Excellent, Watson. You improve with every case." There was no mockery in his tone, only a quiet and genuine approval that I valued more than I would have admitted. "You are correct on all 3 counts, but you have missed the most important detail of the morning." "Which is?" "The locked drawer in Ashcroft's study. It was not merely locked, Watson. It was empty. I could tell from the weight of the cabinet and the way the drawer moved when I tested it. Someone locked that drawer after removing its contents, and the chemical residue around the keyhole suggests that whatever was stored inside was not paper or money, but something of an altogether more dangerous nature." He paused and gazed out across the grey expanse of the park, where the bare trees stood like sentinels against the low and heavy sky. "We have a dead man who was buried alive, a household full of secrets, and a locked drawer that once held something someone was desperate to conceal. The threads are beginning to show themselves, Watson." His eyes narrowed with that familiar and relentless focus. "And I intend to follow every one of them to its end." Chapter 3. The Fear of Premature Burial. It was Holmes himself who suggested we return to Baker Street before pursuing any further line of inquiry. He had fallen into one of his brooding silences during the cab ride home, and I knew better than to disturb him when his mind was working at such velocity. He sat with his chin upon his chest and his eyes fixed on nothing, turning the fragments of the morning's interviews over and over in that vast and restless engine of deduction. I occupied myself by watching the streets pass beyond the window and attempting, with limited success, to arrange my own impressions of the case into some coherent order. Upon our return, Holmes went directly to his desk and began composing a series of telegrams. 6 in total, each written with the swift and unhesitating hand of a man who knew precisely what information he required and where to find it. He rang for the page and dispatched the lot within 10 minutes, then turned his attention to a task that struck me as altogether unexpected. "Watson," he said, pulling on his coat once more. "I'm going to the London Library. I shall be gone no more than 2 hours. In my absence, I would be grateful if you would review whatever the morning papers have published about the Ashcroft affair. I want facts, not editorials, though the editorials may prove instructive in their own way." "The library?" I repeated, somewhat puzzled. "What could you possibly need from the library at this stage?" He paused at the door and regarded me with a faint and enigmatic smile. "I wish to understand what Sir Reginald Ashcroft was afraid of, Watson, and I believe his fears were committed to paper long before his death." He was gone before I could ask what he meant. I spent the next hour and a half with the Times, the Telegraph, and the Standard spread across the sitting-room floor, cutting out every reference to the Ashcroft case I could find. The coverage was extensive and uniformly sensational. The story of a knighted banker buried alive at Highgate had seized the public imagination with a ferocity that bordered on hysteria. Several of the papers had devoted entire columns to the history of premature burial, citing cases from the previous century with ghoulish enthusiasm. One editorial demanded an immediate parliamentary inquiry into the certification of death. Another called for the installation of safety bells in all London coffins, a device, the writer explained, that would allow a prematurely buried person to ring for help from beneath the earth. I set the clippings aside with a feeling of faint disgust. The press had found its monster, and they were feeding it with both hands. But nowhere in the breathless coverage did I find any mention of the figure Cowell had seen standing at the graveside, nor any suggestion that the case might be anything other than a catastrophic medical blunder. The official narrative was simple, satisfying, and, if Holmes was right, entirely wrong. He returned shortly after 1 o'clock carrying a leather satchel that bulged with books. He dropped it on the desk without ceremony and began extracting volumes, stacking them in a precise and deliberate order. I leaned forward to read the spines and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The titles were as follows: Premature Burial and How It May Be Prevented by William Tebb and Colonel Edward Vollum. The Uncertainty of the Signs of Death by Dr. Jean-Jacques Bruyère. Are Buried Alive, The Terrors of Premature Interment by Franz Hartmann, and a slim, unmarked volume that Holmes handled with particular care, turning its pages with a delicacy that suggested he had already identified something of significance within. These, Holmes said, settling into his chair, were not obtained from the London Library. They were obtained from Sir Reginald Ashcroft's personal collection. I stared at him. You went to Ashcroft House. I went to the London Library first. I wished to familiarise myself with the literature on premature burial before examining Ashcroft's own copies. The subject, Watson, has a long and deeply disturbing history, but what interests me is not the history itself. It is the nature of Ashcroft's engagement with it. He opened the Tebb volume and held it toward the lamp. The margins were thick with annotations, handwritten notes in a small, precise script that I recognised from the documents we had seen in Ashcroft's study. Sir Reginald Ashcroft was not a casual reader on this subject, Holmes continued. He was obsessed with it. Look here, he has underlined every passage dealing with the chemical simulation of death. Here, a marginal note beside a case study of a French physician who used chloral hydrate to induce a death-like state in a patient, and here... He turned to a page near the back of the book and tapped a passage with his forefinger. A detailed annotation referencing something called tetrodotoxin, a paralytic substance derived from the puffer fish, known to produce a condition so closely resembling death that even experienced physicians have been deceived. "Good heavens," I murmured. "You believe Ashcroft was researching methods of simulating death?" "I believe the evidence is difficult to interpret otherwise. These annotations are not the idle markings of a man with a morbid curiosity, Watson. They are the notes of a man conducting research. Systematic, thorough, and directed toward a very specific purpose." He closed the book and set it aside, then opened the slim, unmarked volume. It was not a published work at all, I saw now, but a private journal, a leather-bound notebook filled with the same precise handwriting. "I discovered this tucked behind the other volumes on a high shelf in Ashcroft's study," Holmes said. "Lady Ashcroft was good enough to allow me a second examination of the room, though I confess I did not draw her attention to everything I found." He read aloud from an entry dated some 3 months before Ashcroft's death. "I have confirmed through private correspondence with a chemist in Marseille that a carefully measured dose can produce complete paralysis of the voluntary muscles while leaving the heart beating at a rate so diminished as to be undetectable by ordinary means. The subject would appear, to all external observation, to be dead. Recovery, if the dose is precise, occurs within 12 to 18 hours. Holmes looked up. "There are further entries. I shall spare you the full catalogue, but the trajectory is unmistakable. Over the course of several months, Sir Reginald Ashcroft acquired detailed knowledge of how to make a living man appear dead. The question, Watson, is why?" I sat in silence for a moment, attempting to absorb the implications. "You believe he intended to use this knowledge on himself? To stage his own death?" "It is one possibility. There are others." Holmes rose and moved to the mantelpiece, where he stood with his back to the fire and his hands clasped behind him. "Consider the locked drawer in his study, emptied and sealed. Consider the haste with which the funeral was arranged. Consider the 2 glasses on the side table, one washed and returned, the other left in place. And consider the figure at the graveside, a man standing in the dark, waiting. Waiting for what? That is the question upon which this entire case turns." He paused and turned to face me, and I saw in his expression something I had seldom observed in Sherlock Holmes. Not confusion, for his mind was too disciplined for that, but a genuine and almost reluctant uncertainty, as though the case had presented him with a puzzle whose shape he could perceive, but whose final form remained stubbornly hidden. "Let me put to you a hypothesis, Watson, one of several, and by no means the one I am most confident in. Suppose Ashcroft intended to administer this paralytic substance to someone else. Suppose the target was present in the house on the evening of his death. The 2 glasses on the side table would take on a very different significance, would they not? Graves, I said at once. Graves was with him that evening. Indeed. And Graves, by his own admission, was the last person to see Ashcroft alive, or at least the last to admit it. Holmes took up his pipe and filled it slowly. "But there is a difficulty with this theory, Watson, and it is a considerable one. If Ashcroft intended to poison Graves, then how did Ashcroft himself come to be the one lying dead in a coffin?" I opened my mouth to reply, then closed it again. The question was a good one, and I had no answer for it. "Precisely," Holmes said, as though I had spoken aloud. "We are left with 2 possibilities. Either Ashcroft's plan went wrong in some fundamental way, the poison was taken by the wrong person, or in the wrong dose, or the entire sequence of events was deliberate from the beginning, and Ashcroft intended to be buried." "Intended to be buried alive?" I could not keep the incredulity from my voice. "Holmes, that is monstrous." "It is monstrous," he agreed quietly. "But it is not impossible. A man with sufficient knowledge of paralytic toxins, a carefully arranged funeral, and a trusted accomplice waiting to exhume the coffin after nightfall, such a man might stage his own death with a reasonable expectation of survival." He struck a match and held it to the bowl of his pipe. "The plan would require extraordinary nerve and meticulous preparation. It would also require absolute trust in the accomplice. And that, Watson, is where I believe the scheme, if scheme it was, came apart." "The accomplice never came," I said, the full horror of it settling over me like a weight. "The man at the graveside, he was the accomplice. He came the first night. But something prevented him from completing the task. And by the time Ashcroft regained consciousness the following night, he was alone." Holmes regarded me through a thin veil of pipe smoke. "You are getting ahead of the evidence, Watson, which is a dangerous habit in a detective, but an understandable one in a storyteller. We do not yet know that the figure at the graveside was an accomplice. We do not yet know that Ashcroft took the poison voluntarily. What we know is this: a man with detailed knowledge of how to simulate death is now genuinely dead, buried in a coffin he clawed at with his bare hands. Everything else for the moment is conjecture." He moved to the window and looked out into the grey afternoon. The rain had returned, streaming down the glass in crooked rivulets. "Tomorrow I shall speak with Dr. Halstead, the physician who declared Ashcroft dead with such convenient speed. I have several pointed questions for the good doctor, and I suspect his answers will be rather less comfortable than the ones he gave the coroner." He drew on his pipe and exhaled slowly. "I shall also make further inquiries into the financial affairs of both Ashcroft and Graves. Money, Watson, is the great illuminator of motive. When we understand where the money went, we shall understand a great deal more about why a man ended up scratching at the lid of his own coffin." He turned from the window and fixed me with a look of quiet and unshakable determination. "This case has many layers, Watson, and we have barely lifted the first. But I promise you this: before we are done, every secret in that household will be brought into the light. The dead may keep their silence, but the living never can. And not for long." Chapter 4. The Doctor's Testimony. Holmes was gone before breakfast the following morning. I found a note propped against the coffee pot in his sharp, angular hand. "Gone to see Halstead. Do not follow. Will send word if needed. S.H." It was a characteristic instruction, curt, slightly imperious, and entirely confident that I would obey it. I did, though not without a measure of resentment that I concealed even from myself. I spent the morning reviewing my notes on the case and attempting to organize the facts as I understood them. The exercise proved more frustrating than illuminating. Every line of reasoning I pursued seemed to fork and double back upon itself, and I found myself circling the same unanswerable question that Holmes had posed the previous evening. If Ashcroft intended to poison Graves, how had Ashcroft ended up in the coffin? And if Ashcroft intended to be buried, what possible purpose could such a grotesque and perilous scheme have served? Holmes returned shortly before noon. He entered the sitting room with the brisk, energized step of a man who has obtained exactly what he went looking for, hung his coat on the stand, and dropped into his armchair with a look of profound satisfaction. "Dr. Halstead," he announced, "is a liar. Not a gifted one, I'm pleased to say, but a persistent one. He told me 3 things this morning that were demonstrably false, 2 things that were carefully evasive, and 1 thing, almost by accident I suspect, that was extremely useful." "You had better start from the beginning," I said. "I shall do better than that, Watson. I shall start from the end and work backwards, which is, after all, the natural direction of deductive reasoning." He reached for the tobacco in the Persian slipper and began filling his pipe. "The useful thing Dr. Halstead told me, The one true and significant piece of information that escaped him is this. When he examined Sir Reginald Ashcroft on the night of his death, he observed that the body was cold to the touch, but that rigor mortis had not yet set in. That is not entirely unusual, I offered. Depending on the ambient temperature and the constitution of the individual, rigor can be delayed. Agreed. But Halstead examined the body at approximately 10 o'clock in the evening. By his own account, Graves informed him that the collapse had occurred at roughly 8:30, a gap of 90 minutes. Now, Watson, you are a physician. In your professional opinion, would you expect a body to be cold, genuinely cold, not merely cool, after 90 minutes? I considered this. Not under normal circumstances. Algor mortis proceeds gradually. A body in a warm room would retain significant heat for several hours after death. For the skin to feel cold to the touch after only 90 minutes would be highly unusual. Unless, Holmes said, pointing the stem of his pipe at me, the body's temperature had been artificially suppressed before death, or before the appearance of death. A paralytic toxin of the kind described in Ashcroft's journal would slow the heart to a rate barely sufficient to sustain life. Blood flow to the extremities would diminish drastically. The skin would cool. To a physician conducting a hurried examination in a dimly lit room, the result might be indistinguishable from death. And the absence of rigor would support that conclusion, I said, the implications settling over me. If Ashcroft was not actually dead at the time of the examination, rigor would not have begun because the muscles were still technically alive, merely paralyzed. Precisely. Halstead, whether through incompetence or complicity, declared a living man dead. The question is which? You said he lied to you 3 times. He did. First, he claimed that his examination of the body was thorough and conducted according to standard medical practice. This is false. By his own description, he checked for a pulse at the wrist, observed the absence of breathing, and noted the coldness of the skin. He did not use a stethoscope. He did not check for pupillary response. He did not hold a mirror to the lips. Any one of these measures might have detected the faintest signs of life. That could be negligence rather than deception, I said. It could. But his second lie makes negligence a less comfortable explanation. He told me that he had been Sir Reginald's physician for over 15 years, and had visited the house on numerous occasions. When I asked whether he was aware of Ashcroft's interest in toxicology and paralytic substances, he denied it categorically. He said, and I quote as nearly as I can recall, that Sir Reginald had no such interests and that the suggestion was absurd. And you believe otherwise? I know otherwise. Among the correspondence I found in Ashcroft's journal, there are 2 letters from Halstead himself, written on his personal stationery, discussing the physiological effects of tetrodotoxin in clinical settings. The letters are cautious in their language, couched in the vocabulary of academic curiosity, but they make clear that Halstead was not merely aware of Ashcroft's interest in paralytic agents. He was an active participant in the research. I sat back in my chair, struck by the weight of this revelation. Then Halstead may have known that Ashcroft was not truly dead when he signed the certificate. It is a possibility I am not yet prepared to state as fact, but one I am increasingly inclined to regard as probable. Holmes struck a match and lit his pipe. His third lie was subtler, and in some ways more revealing. I asked him about the events of that evening, the sequence in which things occurred. He told me that Graves sent for him by messenger, that he arrived within 20 minutes, and that he went directly to the study where he found Ashcroft on the floor. But when I pressed him on the details, the position of the body, the state of the room, who else was present, he became evasive. He could not recall whether the lamps were lit. He could not say with certainty whether the study door was open or closed when he arrived. These are not the gaps of a man recalling a traumatic evening under stress, Watson. These are the gaps of a man who is constructing a version of events and has not thought through the minor details. What was the one evasive statement you found useful? Holmes smiled thinly. I asked Halstead whether he had been paid for his services that evening. A routine question. I expected a routine answer. Instead, he hesitated. He said he had sent his invoice to the estate in the usual manner. When I asked whether he had received any payment from Ashcroft prior to the death, a retainer perhaps, or an advance for services rendered, he became visibly uncomfortable. He said he could not recall the specifics of his financial arrangements and suggested I direct my inquiries to his secretary. Which tells you what exactly? It tells me that Halstead received money from Ashcroft that he does not wish to account for. The nature of that payment, whether it was for legitimate medical services, for participation in the toxicological research, or for something altogether more sinister, remains to be determined. But the evasion itself is instructive. An innocent man does not flinch at the mention of money, Watson. Only a man who knows the money was tainted. He rose and moved to the fireplace, where he stood with one arm resting on the mantel and his pipe trailing a thin ribbon of smoke toward the ceiling. I pressed him on one final point before I left. I asked whether, in his professional opinion, it was possible that Sir Reginald Ashcroft had been alive at the time of burial. His reaction was extraordinary. He went quite white, Watson, white as the collar around his throat, and for a moment I thought he might collapse himself. Then he recovered his composure and said, with the careful deliberation of a man choosing every word as though his life depended upon it, that such a thing was medically impossible, and that he resented the implication. And you did not believe him? I did not believe him because I was watching his hands. Throughout our entire conversation, Halstead kept his hands flat upon his desk, perfectly still. It was a studied posture, the posture of a man who knows that his hands will betray him if he allows them to move freely. But when I asked whether Ashcroft could have been alive at the time of burial, his left hand curled into a fist so tight that the knuckles went white. He held it for no more than 2 seconds before relaxing it again. But it was enough. Holmes turned to face me. Dr. Halstead knows something, Watson. He may not know the full truth. I am not yet convinced he is the architect of whatever occurred. But he knows that the death certificate he signed was, at best, premature, and, at worst, a deliberate fiction. The question is whether he acted out of ignorance, out of fear, or out of complicity. What will you do? I shall let him stew, Holmes said, with a coldness that was not entirely without satisfaction. A frightened man who believes he is under suspicion will invariably do one of 2 things. He will flee, or he will reach out to whoever he believes can protect him. Either action will tell me a great deal about the shape of this conspiracy. He crossed to the desk and consulted a telegram that had arrived during his absence. His expression shifted, a subtle tightening around the eyes that I had learned to associate with the arrival of significant information. In the meantime, he said, folding the telegram and slipping it into his pocket, I have received a reply from my contact at the Bank of England. Sir Reginald Ashcroft made a series of substantial financial transfers in the weeks preceding his death. The sums are considerable, well in excess of what a man of his position would require for ordinary expenses. The funds were directed to accounts in France and Switzerland, and the transfers were conducted with a degree of discretion that suggests they were not intended to be discovered. He paused and looked at me with an expression that was at once grave and alive with the thrill of the chase. A man who secretly moves his fortune abroad, who researches the chemical simulation of death, whose physician signs a suspiciously hasty death certificate, and whose grave is visited in the dead of night by a figure who stands and waits. These are not the elements of a medical tragedy, Watson. They are the elements of a plan, a meticulous, audacious, and ultimately catastrophic plan. He took up his pipe once more and settled into his chair with the air of a man who was beginning at last to see the outline of the truth through the fog. "We are making progress, Watson. Slow progress, but progress nonetheless. Tomorrow I intend to examine the financial affairs of Lionel Graves and the personal circumstances of Edward Ashcroft. One of them holds the key to the locked drawer, and when that key is found, I believe the rest of the puzzle will follow. Chapter 5: Motives in the Household." The next 2 days were among the busiest I had ever witnessed in Holmes's practice. He was in constant motion, departing Baker Street before dawn, returning at irregular hours with mud on his boots and a distracted gleam in his eye, only to leave again within minutes carrying a fresh list of addresses scrawled on the back of an envelope. He spoke little during these excursions, and when he did, it was in fragments, half-formed observations that seemed directed more at himself than at me. I understood that he was deep in the tunnelling phase of his investigation, burrowing through layers of financial records, personal histories, and public registries, with the patience and precision of a man who knows that the truth is buried somewhere in the ordinary details of other people's lives. On the morning of the 3rd day, he emerged from his bedroom fully dressed and looking, for the first time since the case had begun, genuinely pleased with himself. He sat down at the breakfast table, buttered a piece of toast with uncharacteristic contentment, and said, "I have them, Watson." "You have whom?" "All of them. Every member of that household and their secrets laid bare. It has taken 40 hours of sustained inquiry, 3 visits to Somerset House, 2 uncomfortable conversations with bank officials who would rather have shown me the door, and 1 exceptionally tedious afternoon in the reading room of the Law Society. But I now possess a reasonably complete picture of the financial and personal circumstances of every person connected to Sir Reginald Ashcroft." He pushed his plate aside and leaned forward with his elbows on the table. "Let us begin with the brother. Edward Ashcroft is not merely in debt, Watson. He is drowning in it. His gambling losses over the past 18 months amount to just under £12,000. He has borrowed heavily from private lenders at ruinous rates and has exhausted every avenue of legitimate credit available to him. 3 weeks before his brother's death, he was refused a further loan by the very bank Sir Reginald helped to found. The refusal was, I am told, accompanied by a personal note from Sir Reginald himself, advising Edward to seek professional help for his addiction. That must have been a bitter blow. Bitter enough to provoke the argument the servants overheard on the night of the death. I spoke with 2 of the household staff, a footman and a parlour-maid, both of whom confirmed that Edward arrived at Ashcroft House at approximately 7 o'clock that evening, uninvited and in a state of considerable agitation. He was heard shouting in the study for nearly 20 minutes before he left by the front door, slamming it behind him with such force that a vase was knocked from the hall table. And his movements after that? He claims he went directly to his club on St. James's Street, where he spent the remainder of the evening. I verified this with the club steward, who confirms that Edward arrived at approximately 7:30 and remained until well after midnight. He was seen by multiple members throughout the evening. Then he has an alibi. He has an alibi for the hours after 7:30, Holmes corrected. But the critical window, the period between Ashcroft's collapse and Halstead's arrival, falls between 8:30 and 10 o'clock. Edward was already at his club by then. Unless he returned to Ashcroft House by some undetected route, administered a poison, and returned to his club without being noticed, his involvement in the events of that evening appears unlikely. You sound almost disappointed. I am neither disappointed nor relieved, Watson. I am merely narrowing the field. He reached for his coffee. Now, Lionel Graves. Here the picture becomes considerably more interesting. Graves and Ashcroft founded their joint venture, the Continental Trading Company, some 8 years ago. For the first 5 years the enterprise was profitable, but beginning approximately 3 years ago, the company's fortunes began to decline. Poor investments, shifting markets, and, if my sources at the bank are to be believed, a degree of financial mismanagement that borders on the reckless. On whose part? That is the delicate question. Graves insists that the difficulties were caused by forces beyond his control, market fluctuations, foreign competition, the usual litany. But the records tell a different story. Several of the company's most disastrous investments were made on Graves's authority alone, without Ashcroft's knowledge or consent. When Ashcroft discovered the extent of the losses some 6 months ago, there was a confrontation. I have this on the authority of a junior clerk at the Continental Trading Company who was present when the argument took place. What was the nature of the confrontation? Ashcroft threatened to dissolve the partnership and pursue legal action against Graves for breach of fiduciary duty. The sum in question was substantial, nearly £40,000 in losses attributable to Graves's unauthorised decisions. For a man of Graves's means, such a judgment would have been catastrophic. It would have meant not merely financial ruin but professional disgrace, the end of his career in the city. I considered this for a moment. Then Graves had a powerful motive to wish Ashcroft dead. With Ashcroft gone, the threat of legal action disappears. It does, and there is more. Under the terms of their partnership agreement, in the event of one partner's death, the surviving partner assumes full control of the company's assets and operations. Graves stood to gain not merely the removal of a threat, but the acquisition of a considerable fortune, provided, of course, that no one looked too closely at the books. And has anyone looked closely at the books? Holmes smiled. I have. Or rather, I have engaged an acquaintance at one of the larger accounting firms to examine the records I obtained from the company's registry. His preliminary findings confirm what I suspected. The Continental Trading Company is insolvent. Its debts exceed its assets by a significant margin. Our Graves has been concealing this fact through a series of increasingly desperate accounting manoeuvres that would not survive a competent audit. So Graves is ruined whether Ashcroft lives or dies. Not quite. If Ashcroft dies and the company passes to Graves, he gains time. Time to restructure, to sell assets, to cover his tracks. If Ashcroft lives and pursues legal action, Graves is exposed immediately. The difference is not between ruin and salvation, Watson. It is between a slow decline and a sudden fall. For a man like Graves, that distinction may be worth killing for. He rose from the table and moved to the mantelpiece, where a row of telegrams had been pinned in a neat line. He studied them for a moment before continuing. Now we come to Lady Margaret. She is perhaps the most interesting figure in this household, and certainly the most difficult to read. She married Sir Reginald 11 years ago. She was 24 at the time, the daughter of a country solicitor of no particular distinction. The marriage was, by all accounts, one of convenience rather than affection. Sir Reginald desired a presentable wife to complement his social ambitions, and Margaret desired the security and status that his wealth could provide. A common enough arrangement, I observed. Common, yes, but not always stable. Within the past 2 years, Lady Margaret has formed a close and, according to the household servants, increasingly intimate acquaintance with a solicitor by the name of Arthur Fenwick. Fenwick is a junior partner at a firm in Lincoln's Inn Fields. He is 32, unmarried, and has been a frequent visitor to Ashcroft House, ostensibly in connection with minor legal matters relating to the estate. You believe the relationship is more than professional? The parlour-maid believes it. She reports that Fenwick visited on at least a dozen occasions when Sir Reginald was absent, that he and Lady Margaret were often closeted together in the drawing-room for extended periods, and that on one occasion she observed them in a posture that left little room for ambiguity. Holmes paused. I do not raise this to cast moral judgment, Watson. I raise it because Lady Margaret, as Sir Reginald's widow, stands to inherit the entirety of his personal estate, a sum that, even after the financial transfers to foreign accounts, remains considerable. A woman in love with another man, married to a husband she does not care for, with a fortune to gain from his death. The arithmetic is not difficult. But could she have administered the poison? She told us she went upstairs at 8:30 and did not come down again until 10. She told us that, yes, but I have not yet verified it. The servants' quarters are at the rear of the house, and the upper floors are accessible by 2 separate staircases. It would not have been impossible for Lady Margaret to descend by the back stairs, enter the study, and return to her rooms without being observed. He turned from the mantelpiece and fixed me with a look of weary candour. But I confess, Watson, that the more I learn about this household, the less certain I become about any single theory. We have 3 people with powerful motives, Edward, Graves, and Lady Margaret, and a 4th, Dr. Halstead, whose role remains troublingly ambiguous. Any one of them could have poisoned Ashcroft. Any one of them could have arranged the hasty burial. And yet none of them, so far as I can determine, explains the most puzzling element of the case. "The figure at the graveside," I said. "The figure at the graveside," he confirmed. "A man who stood in the dark beside a freshly filled grave, waiting. Not mourning, Watson. Waiting. As though he expected something to happen. That figure does not belong to any of the motives I have uncovered. Edward is a gambler and a debtor, but he is not the sort of man who stands vigil in a cemetery at midnight. Graves is a desperate financier, not an accomplice to exhumation. And Lady Margaret, whatever her private feelings, would have no reason to visit the grave in secret." He sank into his armchair and stared at the ceiling with the expression of a man wrestling with a problem that refused to yield. "What concerns me, Watson, is not the motive, but the method. We have a household full of people who wanted Sir Reginald Ashcroft dead, and yet the manner of his death suggests something far more elaborate than a simple poisoning. A man does not research paralytic toxins, transfer his fortune overseas, and arrange for a visitor at his own grave unless he is planning something of extraordinary complexity. The motives of his family and associates may be relevant, but I am increasingly convinced that the key to this case lies not in what they did, but in what Ashcroft himself intended to do." He closed his eyes and pressed his fingertips together beneath his chin. "Tomorrow I shall pursue 2 further lines of inquiry. First, the identity of the figure at the graveside. Cowell's description was vague but not useless. A man of medium height, wearing a dark coat, who arrived on foot and departed without haste. I intend to canvass the streets surrounding the cemetery for anyone who may have observed this visitor. Second, the unused train ticket to Calais. If such a ticket exists among Ashcroft's belongings, it will tell us a great deal about the nature of his plan and the timeline he intended to follow." He opened one eye and regarded me with a faint, rueful smile. "Patience, Watson. The threads are multiplying, but they have not yet begun to converge. When they do, the picture will become very clear indeed, and I suspect it will be a picture none of us expected." Chapter 6. The Graveyard Witness. It was not Holmes but I who made the next significant discovery in the case, and I record this fact not out of vanity, but because it illustrates a principle Holmes himself often stated, that the most valuable evidence is frequently obtained not through brilliance but through the simple willingness to be present at the right moment and to listen without prejudice. Holmes had departed early that morning on what he described as a canvassing expedition through the streets and public houses surrounding Highgate Cemetery. He intended to show a general description of the mysterious figure to shopkeepers, cabmen, and anyone else who might have been abroad on the night in question. It was, he admitted, a tedious and likely fruitless exercise, but one that could not be neglected. "Detection, Watson," he said, as he pulled on his gloves, "is 9 parts drudgery and 1 part revelation. The trick is not to abandon the drudgery before the revelation arrives." Left to my own devices, I resolved to make myself useful by calling once more upon Albert Cowell, the Highgate caretaker, whose testimony had set the entire investigation in motion. My intention was straightforward. I wished to review his account in greater detail, pressing for any particulars he might have omitted in the distress of his first visit to Baker Street. Holmes had not asked me to do this, but neither had he forbidden it, and I felt that a second conversation with the man, unconducted in the calmer surroundings of his own cottage, might yield details that the shock of that rainy evening had obscured. Cowell's cottage stood just beyond the western gate of the cemetery, a small, tidy dwelling of dark brick, with a low fence and a narrow garden that even in November showed signs of careful tending. He answered my knock with an expression of wary recognition and admitted me to a cramped but spotless sitting room, where a coal fire burned steadily in a blackened grate. "Dr. Watson," he said, gesturing me toward a chair, "I had not expected to see you again so soon. Has Mr. Holmes learned anything?" "Mr. Holmes is pursuing several lines of inquiry," I said, adopting the deliberately vague tone I had learned from long association with the man himself. "I've come to ask you a few further questions, if you are willing." "I have told you everything I know, sir." "I am sure you have told us everything you believe to be relevant," I said gently. "But in my experience, the details a man considers unimportant are often the very ones that prove most valuable. I should like to return to the night you saw the figure standing at the graveside. You said you watched him from the shelter of the chapel wall for approximately 20 minutes. Cowell nodded. "That is correct." "During those 20 minutes, did the figure do anything at all? Did he move? Did he crouch or kneel? Did he touch the grave?" Cowell frowned and stared into the fire. "He stood very still, sir. That was what struck me most, the stillness of him. Most people who visit a grave, even at night, they move about, they shift their weight, they look around. This man did none of that. He stood with his hands at his sides and his face turned down toward the earth as though he were listening." "Listening?" I repeated. "That is the impression I had, sir. I cannot say why, but something in his posture, the way his head was inclined, put me in mind of a man pressing his ear to a door." A cold sensation passed through me. If Cowell's impression was accurate, the figure had not been mourning, or even merely waiting. He had been listening for sounds from beneath the ground, listening perhaps for the first stirrings of a man regaining consciousness inside a sealed coffin. "You mentioned that a carriage passed along the road beyond the gates, and that when you looked back, the figure was gone. Did you hear the carriage stop? Could the man have departed in it?" Cowell considered this carefully. "I did not hear it stop, sir, but the road curves sharply beyond the north gate, and a carriage might have slowed there without my hearing it. It is possible, I suppose." "And the figure himself? You described him as a man of medium height, wearing a dark coat. Is there anything else you can recall? The colour of his hat? Whether he carried anything? The manner of his walk?" "He wore a dark hat, black or very dark grey. I could not see his face. He carried nothing that I could observe. As for his walk—" Cowell paused and rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "When he left, when I lost sight of him, he moved quickly. Not running, mind you, but with purpose. Long strides. The walk of a younger man, I should say, not elderly." "How young?" "I could not swear to it, Dr. Watson, but my impression was a man of 30 or 40. "No older." I noted this down. It was not much, but it was more than we had before. A man of medium height, relatively young, who moved with purpose, and who stood in perfect stillness beside a grave in the dead of night, with the attitude of one who was listening. The image was vivid and deeply unsettling. I was preparing to take my leave when Cowell spoke again, and what he said next stopped me at the threshold. "There is one other thing, Dr. Watson. I did not mention it before because I was not certain it was connected, and I did not wish to waste Mr. Holmes's time with trifles, but you have asked me to think carefully, and so I shall tell you." Please do. On the evening after the burial, the same evening I saw the figure, I found something on the ground near the grave. It was half hidden in the mud, and I nearly passed it by. A matchbook, sir. Not the ordinary sort you buy at a tobacconist. It was printed with a name, a business, I took it to be. Foreign letters. I could not read them. My pulse quickened. Do you still have it? Cowell rose without a word and crossed to a small wooden shelf above the fireplace. He reached behind a clock and produced a slim cardboard matchbook, creased and mud-stained but largely intact. He handed it to me, and I examined it under the lamp. The matchbook was of continental manufacture. That much was immediately apparent from the weight of the card and the style of the printing. On the front cover, in gilt lettering against a dark blue background, was a name, Le Signe d'Or. Below it, in smaller type, an address in Calais. I turned it over in my hands. Le Signe d'Or, the Golden Swan. A hotel, I presumed, or perhaps a restaurant, in Calais. The same city to which, according to Holmes's earlier discovery, Sir Reginald Ashcroft had purchased an unused train ticket. Mr. Cowell, I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage, this may be the most important piece of evidence in the entire case. I must take it to Mr. Holmes at once. Cowell looked startled. A matchbook, sir? You truly think so? I truly do. I left the cottage at a pace that was very nearly a run and hailed the first cab I could find on Swain's Lane. By the time I reached Baker Street, Holmes had not yet returned, and I was left to pace the sitting-room in a state of considerable agitation, turning the matchbook over and over in my fingers and willing the sound of his footstep on the stair. He arrived shortly after 4 o'clock, looking tired and somewhat dispirited. His canvassing expedition had produced little of value. A publican on Highgate Hill thought he might have seen a man matching the description walking south at a late hour, but could not be certain of the date or the time. Holmes hung his coat with the air of a man who has spent a long day digging in barren ground. "Watson," he said, sinking into his chair, "I trust your afternoon was more productive than mine." I believe it was. I held out the matchbook. Holmes took it, glanced at it, and became utterly still. For perhaps 5 seconds he did not move or speak. Then his eyes lifted to mine, and in them I saw that sharp, electric intensity that marked the moments when a case turned upon its axis. "Where did you get this?" I told him everything. My visit to Cowell, the caretaker's recollection of the figure's posture, the detail about the purposeful stride, and the discovery of the matchbook near the grave. Holmes listened without interruption, his fingers turning the small cardboard object with the delicate precision of a jeweller examining a stone. "Le Signe d'Or," he murmured. "Calais. Watson, do you understand what this means?" "It connects the figure at the graveside to Calais, the same destination as Ashcroft's unused train ticket." "It does considerably more than that." He rose and crossed to his desk, where he pulled open a drawer and extracted the pocket notebook in which he had been recording the details of the case. He flipped through several pages and stopped at an entry near the middle. "The financial transfers," he said. "Ashcroft moved his money to accounts in France and Switzerland. The French account is held at a bank in, you will not be surprised to learn, Calais. A man who transfers his fortune to Calais purchases a train ticket to Calais, and whose grave is visited by someone carrying a matchbook from a Calais establishment. These are not coincidences, Watson. These are the coordinates of a destination." He held the matchbook up to the lamp and examined it with his lens. "This is from a hotel, a small, discreet hotel on the Rue de la Citadelle, the sort of establishment that caters to travellers who value privacy over luxury. The gilt lettering is slightly worn, which suggests the matchbook has been carried for some time, weeks rather than days. Whoever dropped this near Ashcroft's grave had been to Le Signe d'Or before, or at least had possessed this matchbook long enough for it to show where." He set down the lens and turned to me with an expression I had seen only a handful of times in our long association. the expression of a man who has been groping in the dark and has suddenly felt his hand close around the shape of the truth. The figure at the graveside was not a mourner, Watson. He was not a curious stranger. He was an accomplice, a man who had been to Calais, who knew about the hotel, who was part of the plan. He came to the cemetery on the night after the burial because he was supposed to do something. He stood at the grave and listened because he was waiting for a signal, the sound of knocking from below, the signal that Ashcroft had regained consciousness and was ready to be exhumed. But he did not dig, I said. He stood there for 20 minutes and then he left. Yes, Holmes said quietly, and for the first time I heard something in his voice that was not analytical excitement, but a kind of grim and reluctant pity. He came, and he waited, and he listened, and then he left. The question that has haunted this case from the very beginning, why did the accomplice not complete his task, remains unanswered. But we are closer now, Watson. We know where the plan was meant to lead. We know there was a destination, a hotel, a new life waiting across the channel. And we know that someone, for reasons we do not yet understand, chose to walk away and leave Sir Reginald Ashcroft to die beneath the earth. He moved to the window and stood in silence for a long moment, gazing out at the darkening street below. Tomorrow I shall send a wire to an associate in Calais and have him make inquiries at Le Cygne d'Or. I want to know whether a room was reserved, under what name, and for what dates. I also want to know whether anyone matching Ashcroft's description, or the description of our mysterious visitor, has been seen there in recent weeks. He turned back to me, and the pity I had glimpsed a moment earlier had been replaced by something harder and more resolute. We are close, Watson. The shape of this thing is becoming visible. A man who planned his own burial, an accomplice who failed him, and a fortune waiting in a foreign port. What remains is to discover why the plan collapsed, and whether the failure was an accident or a betrayal. Chapter 7. The Hidden Preparations. 3 days passed before Holmes received a reply from his associate in Calais, a former agent of the French Sûreté by the name of Deschamps, whom Holmes had assisted some years earlier in the matter of a forged bond that had surfaced in the offices of a Parisian banking house. Deschamps was, by Holmes's account, a man of modest intellect but exceptional thoroughness, and the report he telegraphed back to Baker Street on the morning of the 4th day proved the accuracy of that assessment on both counts. Holmes read the telegram at the breakfast table, his eyes moving rapidly across the text. Then he read it again, more slowly, and set it down beside his plate with the careful deliberation of a man placing a final piece into a complex mechanism. "Watson," he said, "our dead banker may have been planning a journey far more elaborate than the grave." "What has Deschamps found?" "A great deal. First, a room was indeed reserved at Le Cygne d'Or, the hotel on the Rue de la Citadelle. The reservation was made 5 weeks before Ashcroft's death by letter under the name William Crane. The room was booked for an indefinite stay, beginning on the date that fell precisely 3 days after Ashcroft's burial. Payment was made in advance by international bank draft, drawn, I should add, on the same Calais account to which Ashcroft transferred his fortune. William Crane, I said. An alias. An alias constructed with some care. Crane is an English surname common enough to avoid attention, but distinctive enough to serve as a reliable identifier. The reservation letter was written in English, but posted from a London address. A commercial postal office in Cheapside, the sort of establishment where a man may send correspondence anonymously for a small fee. Then Ashcroft planned to assume a new identity in Calais. He planned to disappear entirely. But there is more. Holmes consulted the telegram again. Deschamps made inquiries at the hotel and was permitted to examine the guest register. No one by the name of William Crane ever arrived. The room stood empty for a week before the proprietor, having received no further communication, let it to another guest. However, and this is the point upon which the entire case may turn, Deschamps spoke to a porter at the hotel who recalled something unusual. On the evening the room was supposed to be occupied, a man arrived at the hotel and asked for Mr. Crane. When told that Mr. Crane had not yet checked in, the man appeared agitated. He waited in the lobby for approximately 2 hours, then left without giving his name. The accomplice, I said immediately, almost certainly. The porter described him as an Englishman of middle age, medium height, clean-shaven, with dark hair going grey at the temples. He wore a well-made coat and carried a small travelling case. His French was poor, but serviceable. He seemed, the porter said, like a man who had expected to meet someone and could not understand why that person had failed to appear. Holmes set the telegram aside and rose from the table. He crossed to the wall where he had pinned a series of notes and clippings related to the case, and stood before them with his hands clasped behind his back, studying the arrangement as though it were a map of enemy territory. "Let us reconstruct the plan as it was meant to unfold," he said. "Ashcroft, for reasons we shall examine shortly, decides to vanish. He researches paralytic toxins and identifies a substance capable of producing a convincing simulation of death. He transfers his fortune to foreign accounts. He books a hotel room in Calais under a false name. He purchases a train ticket for the crossing. And he enlists an accomplice, a man he trusts, to complete the most dangerous element of the scheme, the exhumation. Precisely. The plan required Ashcroft to take the poison, be declared dead by a compliant or deceived physician, be buried, and then be dug up by his accomplice under cover of night. Once freed from the coffin, he would travel to Calais, assume his new identity, and begin a new life with his fortune intact. To the world, Sir Reginald Ashcroft would be dead. To himself, he would be free. He turned from the wall and faced me. "It is an audacious plan, Watson. Reckless even, but not irrational. A man facing sufficient desperation or sufficient danger might well conclude that death was the only reliable escape. But what was he escaping from, I asked. He was wealthy, respected, knighted. What could possibly have driven him to such extremes? That is the question I spent yesterday afternoon attempting to answer, and I believe I have found it." Holmes moved to his desk and opened a folder containing several sheets of paper covered in his own handwriting. "I have obtained, through channels I shall not bore you with, a summary of the legal proceedings that were being prepared against Sir Reginald Ashcroft at the time of his death." "Legal proceedings?" "A criminal investigation, Watson, conducted quietly by the Serious Fraud Office. The details are complex, but the essence is this. Ashcroft had been systematically embezzling funds from the London Continental Bank for a period of at least 4 years. The sums involved are staggering. He used his position as senior partner to authorise fraudulent transfers, as create fictitious accounts and divert client deposits into private holdings. The total amount misappropriated is estimated at more than £120,000. I stared at him. Good Lord. The investigation was initiated by an anonymous complaint filed some 8 months ago. The complainant provided specific details of the fraudulent transactions, account numbers, dates, amounts, that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of the bank's internal operations. The Fraud Office began a quiet inquiry. Ashcroft, through sources of his own, became aware of the investigation approximately 3 months ago. It was at precisely that point that he began his research into paralytic toxins, initiated the financial transfers to Calais, and made the hotel reservation under the name William Crane. He was running, I said. He was running. The investigation would have destroyed him, not merely his reputation, but his liberty. A conviction for fraud on this scale would have meant years in prison. For a man of Ashcroft's vanity and social standing, that prospect must have been intolerable, and so he devised an alternative. He would die, or rather, He would appear to die. He would shed the identity of Sir Reginald Ashcroft like a snake shedding its skin, and emerge on the other side of the channel as William Crane, a private gentleman of independent means, answerable to no one. Holmes paused and picked up a second sheet from the folder. There is one further detail that bears examination. The anonymous complaint that triggered the fraud investigation. I have made inquiries into its origin. The fraud office would not, of course, reveal the identity of the complainant directly, but I have established, through a process of elimination and no small amount of inference, that the complaint originated from within the Continental Trading Company. Graves, I said. That is my strong suspicion. Graves had access to the bank's records through his partnership with Ashcroft. He was also, as we have established, facing financial ruin of his own, ruin caused in large part by the very embezzlement that Ashcroft was conducting. The money Ashcroft stole from the bank was money that should have been available to sustain the Continental Trading Company. Graves may not have understood the full extent of the fraud initially, but as his own financial position deteriorated, he would have begun to scrutinize the accounts more carefully. At some point, he discovered what Ashcroft was doing, and he reported it. Which means Ashcroft had a motive to harm Graves as well. Holmes nodded slowly, and here the case takes its darkest turn. Remember the two glasses in the study, one washed and returned to the cabinet, the other left on the side table. Remember that Graves was present in the house on the evening of Ashcroft's death. And remember the outline of the plan as we have reconstructed it. Ashcroft intended to fake his own death and disappear. But what if that was only half the plan? What if Ashcroft intended not merely to escape, but to punish the man who had betrayed him? I felt the hairs rise on the back of my neck. You think Ashcroft planned to poison Graves as well? I think it is entirely possible that on the evening of his supposed death, Ashcroft administered a dose of the paralytic toxin to Graves, perhaps in a glass of wine or brandy, with the intention of rendering him unconscious or worse. The second glass, washed and returned, may have contained the poison intended for Graves. Whether the poison was actually administered, and what its effects may have been, I cannot yet determine. Graves appeared alive and well when we spoke with him, but a carefully measured dose might have produced only temporary effects: confusion, weakness, a gap in memory. That would explain his vagueness about the events of the evening, I said. When we questioned him, he seemed uncertain about the details. It would explain a great deal. But it raises yet another question. If Ashcroft poisoned Graves and then took the toxin himself, how did the sequence of events proceed from there? Graves was supposedly the one who sent for Dr. Halstead. If Graves was incapacitated by the poison, who actually summoned the doctor? He fell silent and stood very still, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, with the concentrated intensity of a man performing complex calculations in his head. There is a gap in the chain, Watson, a missing link. Someone else was involved, someone who was present in the house that evening, who knew about the plan or who stumbled upon it, and who ensured that the machinery of death and burial was set in motion. Halstead may be that link. Or there may be another figure we have not yet identified. He gathered the papers from his desk and placed them carefully back in the folder. But the broad outline is now clear. Ashcroft was a criminal fleeing justice. He devised an elaborate scheme to fake his death and escape to France. The scheme required an accomplice to exhume him after burial. That accomplice travelled to Calais, waited at the hotel, and, when Ashcroft failed to appear, returned to London and visited the grave. He stood in the darkness and listened for signs of life. And then, for reasons unknown, he walked away. Holmes moved to the window and looked out into the fading light. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, stripped of the intellectual excitement that had animated it moments before. The accomplice did not abandon Ashcroft through carelessness. Watson. He went to the cemetery. He stood at the grave. He was prepared to dig. Something stopped him. Something he saw, or heard, or feared. And whatever it was, it condemned a man to the most terrible death imaginable. He drew the curtain against the evening and turned back into the room. I must find the accomplice. He is the key to everything, the missing piece that will make sense of all the others. And I believe I know where to begin looking. The porter at Le Cygne d'Or described a clean-shaven Englishman of middle age with dark hair going grey at the temples. That description fits no one in the Ashcroft household, but it matches very closely a man whose name has surfaced only once in our investigation and whom I have not yet had occasion to interview. Who? Arthur Fenwick, Holmes said. Lady Margaret's solicitor, a man of 32, unmarried, with dark hair, a man with connections to the Ashcroft household, a man whose visits to the house were frequent, private, and carefully arranged. He reached for his coat. Tomorrow, Watson, I shall pay Mr. Fenwick a visit, and I think he will find my questions rather more difficult to evade than a locked drawer. Chapter 8. The Coffin Examination. 3 days had passed since my discovery of the matchbook, and in that time Holmes had been engaged in a flurry of activity that left even Mrs. Hudson, a woman long accustomed to the eccentricities of her most famous lodger, shaking her head in quiet bewilderment. Telegrams arrived at all hours, messengers came and went. Holmes disappeared for an entire afternoon and returned smelling of formaldehyde and coal tar, offering no explanation beyond a distracted murmur that the mortuary at St. Bartholomew's had been, as always, most accommodating. I had, in the interim, compiled my notes on the case into what I hoped was a coherent narrative, though I confess the act of writing only deepened my confusion. The facts, taken individually, were strange enough. Taken together, they formed a picture that seemed to shift and rearrange itself each time I believed I had fixed it in place. A banker who researched paralytic poisons, a physician who signed a hasty death certificate, a fortune transferred to foreign accounts, an unused train ticket, a matchbook from a hotel in Calais, a figure standing in the darkness beside a grave, listening, and at the centre of it all, a man who had clawed at the lid of his own coffin until his fingers bled. It was on the morning of the 4th day that Holmes announced, with the quiet authority of a general ordering a decisive advance, that we would return to Highgate Cemetery. "I wish to examine the coffin one final time," he said, pulling on his gloves. "I have been thinking about those scratches, Watson, and I believe I missed something on our first visit, not through carelessness, but because I did not yet possess the context necessary to understand what I was seeing." "What context do you mean?" "The context provided by Ashcroft's journal, by the matchbook, by the financial transfers, and by the behaviour of Dr. Halstead. When I first examined that coffin, I was looking for evidence of a crime committed against Sir Reginald Ashcroft. I now wish to examine it with a very different question in mind." He would say no more, and I knew better than to press him. We collected Cowell from his cottage, and descended once more into the open grave, which had been covered with tarpaulin at Holmes's request, and left undisturbed by order of Inspector Lestrade, who had been persuaded, with some difficulty, that the case warranted further investigation. The coffin lay as we had left it, its lid propped against the wall of the pit. The satin lining was stained and discoloured, and the scratches on the underside of the lid stood out in the grey morning light like the marks of some desperate animal. Holmes lowered himself into the grave with the ease of a man descending into a familiar armchair, and crouched beside the coffin, his magnifying lens already in hand. For a long time he said nothing. He examined the scratches with painstaking care, tracing each one with the tip of his finger, measuring their depth, their angle, their distribution across the surface of the lid. He studied the edges of the gouges where splinters of wood had been torn away. He examined the brass fittings, the handles, the hinges, the locking mechanism, with equal attention. Then he turned to the interior of the coffin itself, running his lens along the satin lining, the padding beneath it, and the wooden base. I watched from the edge of the pit, my collar turned up against the chill. Cowell stood beside me, his face drawn and apprehensive. At last Holmes spoke, and his voice carried an unusual quality, a measured calm that I had learned to associate not with uncertainty, but with the approach of a conclusion. "Watson, come down here if you would." I descended into the grave and knelt beside him. He held the lens toward the coffin lid and indicated a cluster of scratches near the centre. "What do you observe about these marks?" I studied them carefully. "They are deep, forceful, consistent with a man clawing at the wood in a state of extreme panic." "Yes. But look more closely at the depth and uniformity. These gouges are not shallow at the edges and deep at the centre, as you would expect from fingers weakening over time. They are uniformly deep from beginning to end. The force behind them did not diminish." "Perhaps the panic sustained his strength," I offered. "Perhaps, but consider the physiological reality. According to Ashcroft's own research, recorded in meticulous detail in his journal, the paralytic toxin he studied produces complete muscular paralysis lasting between 12 and 18 hours. Recovery is gradual. The voluntary muscles regain function slowly, beginning with the extremities. A man recovering from such a dose would experience several hours of partial paralysis before achieving full motor control. His first movements would be weak, clumsy, and uncoordinated." He tapped the scratches with his forefinger. "These marks were not made by a man gradually recovering the use of his limbs. These were made by a man in full possession of his strength from the very first instant. The force is consistent throughout. The angles suggest powerful, deliberate movements, not the feeble scraping of half-paralyzed fingers." I stared at the marks, and a strange unease began to settle over me. The sense that the case was about to pivot in a direction I had not anticipated. "What are you saying, Holmes?" He set down the lens and looked at me. "I am saying that the scratches on this coffin lid were not made by a man recovering from a self-administered paralytic dose. They were made by a man who was fully conscious and fully strong, a man who woke in this coffin with no residual effects of any poison whatsoever. But that would mean... it would mean that either the poison wore off far more quickly than Ashcroft's research predicted, or..." He paused, and in that pause I felt the full weight of the deduction that was forming behind his grey and penetrating eyes. "Or Sir Reginald Ashcroft was not the person who administered the dose. Someone else administered it to him. Someone who used a different substance, or a different concentration than the one Ashcroft had prepared for his own use." I opened my mouth to reply, but Holmes was not finished. He reached into the coffin and lifted a corner of the satin lining, revealing the bare wood beneath. Scratched into the surface, not with fingernails, but with something harder, perhaps a cufflink or a button, were several crude marks, not random gouges of panic, but shapes, letters. "Good God," I breathed. The letters were rough and barely legible, carved in the frantic hand of a man working in absolute darkness, with failing air and trembling fingers. But they were unmistakable. G-R-A, and then nothing. The effort had been abandoned, whether from exhaustion, from the encroaching suffocation, or from the terrible realization that no one would ever read what he had written. Holmes regarded the letters in silence for a long moment. Then he replaced the lining and climbed out of the grave. "3 letters," he said quietly, standing at the edge of the pit and looking down at the coffin with an expression I could not entirely decipher. "The beginning of a name, or the beginning of an accusation. Graves, Watson." In his final moments, with the air running out and the darkness closing in, Sir Reginald Ashcroft tried to write the name of the man he believed had put him there. We walked in silence through the cemetery grounds. The morning mist had not yet lifted, and the great monuments of Highgate rose on either side of the path, like the ruins of a forgotten civilization. Cowell had remained behind to replace the tarpaulin, and we were alone among the dead. "Let me be certain I understand," I said at last. "You believe Ashcroft planned to fake his own death using a paralytic poison, be buried, be exhumed by an accomplice, and flee to Calais with his hidden fortune. But somewhere in the execution of this plan, something went catastrophically wrong. The poison he received was not the one he had prepared. Someone substituted or altered the dose, and that someone was Lionel Graves." "That is my working hypothesis," Holmes said. "Consider the sequence of events as we now understand them. Ashcroft dines with Graves on the evening in question. The meeting concerns financial disputes that, as we have established, threatened Graves with legal action and professional ruin. Ashcroft has already prepared the ground for his disappearance. The money has been transferred, the train ticket purchased, the hotel in Calais arranged. He intends to administer the paralytic to himself after Graves departs, collapse in his study, and allow Halstead, who is almost certainly complicit, to declare him dead. But Graves discovers the plan, or some portion of it. Perhaps he finds the poison. Perhaps Halstead, whose courage is clearly limited, lets something slip under pressure. Perhaps Graves simply observes the preparations and draws his own conclusions. However he learns of it, Graves sees an opportunity. If Ashcroft intends to simulate his own death, then Graves need only ensure that the simulation becomes reality. He substitutes the carefully measured dose with something stronger, something from which there will be no recovery, or he simply allows the plan to proceed and then ensures that the accomplice never arrives to complete the exhumation. "The accomplice," I said. "The man with the matchbook." "Yes." "The accomplice comes to the cemetery on the first night, the night after the burial. He stands at the grave and listens, just as Cowell described. But Ashcroft has not yet regained consciousness because the altered dose takes longer to wear off, or because the accomplice has been told to come at the wrong time. He waits, hears nothing, and eventually departs. By the time Ashcroft wakes the following night, clawing at the lid with the full and desperate strength of a man who has not been weakened by the poison he expected, because he received a different poison entirely, the accomplice is gone, and no one comes." Holmes stopped walking and turned to face me. The mist curled between the headstones around us, and his face was very grave. "My dear Watson," he said, and there was a weight in his voice that I had rarely heard. "I believe Sir Reginald Ashcroft intended to commit a perfect crime, to vanish from the world with a stolen fortune and begin a new life in France. But I also believe that his plan was discovered and turned against him by a man who stood to lose everything if Ashcroft survived. Graves did not merely allow Ashcroft to die. He engineered the failure of the escape. He took the architect's own design and made it into a tomb. Can you prove it?" "Not yet. The 3 letters scratched into the coffin are suggestive but not conclusive. A defense barrister would argue they could mean anything. The matchbook connects the accomplice to Calais but does not identify him. The financial records show motive but not method. What I need is the accomplice himself. Or if I can find the man who was meant to dig up that coffin, the man who carried a matchbook from Le Cygne d'Or and who stood listening at the graveside, I will have the final piece of the puzzle." He resumed walking, his pace quickening, as it always did, when the chase was nearing its end. "I've already set inquiries in motion. My contact in Calais has confirmed that a room was reserved at Le Cygne d'Or under the name Renard, French for fox, Watson, a pseudonym that speaks to a certain self-regard on someone's part. The reservation was made 3 weeks before Ashcroft's death and was never claimed. The hotel has a description of the man who made the booking, a description that, I am told, matches no one in the Ashcroft household." "A hired man, then? Someone outside the family?" "Almost certainly. A man recruited specifically for the task of exhumation. Someone with the nerve and the physical capability to dig up a coffin in the dead of night. Finding him is now my highest priority, and I have reason to believe it will not take long. A man who has promised payment for a service he did not complete will not have gone far. He will be waiting, either for his money or for an explanation. Holmes paused at the cemetery gate and looked back along the path we had walked. The mist had thickened, and the graves had disappeared into a soft and featureless white. Tomorrow, Watson, I believe this case will begin to resolve itself. The threads are converging. Graves, Halstead, the accomplice, the altered poison, they are all connected, and the connections are becoming visible. One more piece of evidence, one more testimony, and the picture will be complete. He turned and stepped through the gate into the grey London morning, and I followed, carrying with me the image of those 3 desperate letters carved into the wood of a dead man's coffin, the last words of a man who had schemed to cheat death and had instead been cheated by it. Chapter 9. The Perfect Crime That Failed. The following evening, Holmes asked me to remain at Baker Street and to expect visitors. He offered no further explanation, and his manner, at once tightly controlled and vibrating with suppressed energy, told me that events were approaching their climax. He had spent the greater part of the day behind a closed door, emerging only twice, once to dispatch a telegram and once to examine a parcel that arrived by special courier shortly before 4 o'clock. The parcel contained, so far as I could observe, a sheaf of documents and a small glass vial wrapped in cotton wool, which Holmes studied for several minutes under his lamp before locking it away in the drawer of his desk. At 7:30, there came a knock at the front door, and Mrs. Hudson showed up a man I had not seen before. He was perhaps 35, wiry and sharp-featured, with the weathered complexion of someone who spent much of his time out of doors. His clothes were decent but not fashionable, and he carried himself with a cautious, watchful air that reminded me of a fox approaching an unfamiliar clearing. He removed his hat and stood just inside the doorway, his eyes moving rapidly between Holmes and myself. "Mr. Pellerin," Holmes said, rising from his chair. "Thank you for coming. Please sit down." The man hesitated, then lowered himself into the basket chair with the rigid posture of someone prepared to leave at a moment's notice. His hands rested on his knees, and I noticed that his fingers were calloused and strong, the hands of a man accustomed to physical labour. "You said in your message that you could explain what happened," Pellerin said. His English was fluent, but carried the unmistakable cadence of a French accent. "You said you knew about the arrangement." "I know a great deal about the arrangement, Mr. Pellerin, but I should like to hear your account of it first, if you would be so kind. You may speak freely. Dr. Watson is my associate, and nothing you say in this room will reach the police without my consent." Pellerin studied Holmes for a long moment, as though weighing the value of this assurance against the risk of disclosure. Then something in him seemed to give way, the slow collapse of a man who has been carrying a burden too heavy for one pair of shoulders. "I was hired 6 weeks ago," he began. "A man came to me in Calais, a man I had done work for once before, moving cargo at the docks that the customs officers were not meant to see. He told me there was a job in London. A gentleman needed assistance with a private matter. The pay was generous, £200, half in advance. I was told that I would need to travel to London, wait for a signal, and then perform a single task on a single night. After that, I would return to Calais, and the second payment would be wired to my bank." "And the task?" Holmes asked. "I was to dig up a coffin." Pellerin said it flatly without drama, as though describing the unloading of a crate. "I was given the location, Highgate Cemetery, the western ground. I was given the date of the burial and told to come to the grave on the night following. I was to dig down to the coffin, open the lid and assist the man inside to climb out. He would be alive, I was told. He would be weak but conscious. I was to take him to a carriage that would be waiting on the road beyond the north gate, and from there he would make his own way." And you accepted this commission without hesitation? I could not help asking. Pellerin turned his sharp eyes on me. I am not a man who asks too many questions, Doctor. £200 is a great deal of money. I was told the gentleman had his reasons, and that no one would be harmed. It was not my business to judge. Please continue, Holmes said. I arrived in London 4 days before the burial, and I took a room near King's Cross under the name Martin, not my own, naturally. On the day of the burial, I visited the cemetery during the public hours to familiarise myself with the layout. I noted the position of the grave, the location of the gates, the paths between them. I returned that night, the first night after the burial, at 11:30. You went to the grave. I did. I stood beside it and waited, as I had been instructed. I was told that if the plan had succeeded, I might hear sounds from below. Movement, tapping, perhaps a voice. I was to listen for these sounds, and when I heard them, begin digging. I'd brought the necessary tools in a canvas bag, which I left hidden behind a monument 50 yards from the plot. And what did you hear? Pellerin shook his head slowly. Nothing. I stood there for more than an hour. The ground was silent. I pressed my ear to the earth twice, and there was nothing, no sound, no vibration, nothing at all. I began to think the plan had failed. Perhaps the gentleman had not taken the substance, or perhaps the dose had been insufficient, and he had truly died. I did not know what to do. My instructions covered only the successful outcome. I had been told nothing about what to do if the man did not wake. So you left, Holmes said. I left. I returned to my room and waited. I'd been given an address in London where I could send word if anything went wrong, a solicitor's office near Lincoln's Inn. I sent a message the following morning, explaining that I had heard nothing and asking for further instructions. Holmes leaned forward very slightly. And what response did you receive? That is the thing, Mr. Holmes. I received a reply that same afternoon, a hand-delivered note, unsigned, telling me that the plan had changed. I was told that my services were no longer required. I was instructed to return to Calais immediately and to destroy all correspondence related to the arrangement. The note said that the second payment of £100 would be wired to my account within the week. And was it? It was. I checked the account 3 days after my return to Calais. The money was there. Holmes sat back in his chair and steepled his fingers. Tell me about the solicitor's office, the address where you sent your message. What was the name? Fenwick and Associates, Lincoln's Inn Fields. I felt the blood drain from my face. Arthur Fenwick, the solicitor with whom Lady Margaret Ashcroft had been conducting her private acquaintance, the man the servants had seen visiting Ashcroft House on numerous occasions when Sir Reginald was absent. Holmes showed no visible reaction. His expression remained perfectly composed, though I caught a brief flicker in his eyes, the silent acknowledgement of a piece falling into its appointed place. Mr. Pellerin, Holmes said, I have one further question. The man who originally hired you in Calais, the man who came to you with the proposition, can you describe him? I can do better than that, Mr. Holmes. I can give you his name. He called himself Gerard when we first met, but I learned his real name from a mutual acquaintance at the docks. His name is Vincent Labarre. He is a Frenchman, a former army officer who now involves himself in various private commissions of a discreet nature. He operates out of Calais and occasionally from Paris. And you believe Labarre was acting as an intermediary, that he was hired by someone in London to recruit you for the task? I am certain of it. Labarre is not a man who originates schemes. He is a man who carries them out. Someone in London made the arrangement, and Labarre found the man to do the digging. That man was me. Holmes nodded slowly. Thank you, Mr. Pellerin. You have been remarkably forthcoming, and I give you my word that your cooperation will be taken into account Should this matter come before a court, you may go." Pellerin rose, replaced his hat, and paused at the door. "The man in the coffin, the gentleman I was meant to help, he is truly dead?" "He is truly dead," Holmes said quietly. "He died alone, in the dark, clawing at the lid above him. The help that was promised never came." Something passed across Pellerin's face, not guilt precisely, but something adjacent to it, a shadow of complicity that would not easily be shaken. He nodded once and left without another word. When his footsteps had faded on the stair, Holmes rose and moved to the fireplace. He stood with his back to me for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was measured and deliberate, as though he were setting out the pieces of a chessboard for a final game. "The picture is nearly complete, Watson. Let me lay it before you as I now understand it." He turned to face me. Sir Reginald Ashcroft was a man of considerable intelligence and even greater ambition. At some point in the past year, he conceived a plan of extraordinary audacity. He would fake his own death, disappear from England, and begin a new life in France with the fortune he had secretly transferred abroad. The plan required 3 things: a paralytic substance capable of simulating death, a compliant physician willing to sign a false death certificate, and an accomplice willing to exhume the coffin after burial. He obtained all 3. The poison he researched and acquired himself. Halstead, whether through bribery, blackmail, or shared interest in the toxicological research, agreed to certify the death without conducting a thorough examination. And through Fenwick, Lady Margaret's solicitor, and, I now believe, her lover, an intermediary, was engaged in Calais to recruit a man for the physical task of digging up the coffin. "Fenwick," I said. "Then Lady Margaret was part of the plan?" "I believe she was, not as its architect, but as its beneficiary. Consider her position, a young woman trapped in a loveless marriage, with a fortune to inherit, and a man she preferred waiting in the wings. If Ashcroft vanished and was declared dead, she would inherit his estate. The financial transfers to France were Ashcroft's provision for his own new life. The remainder, the house, the investments, the accounts that stayed in England, would go to Lady Margaret. She would be wealthy, free, and reunited with Fenwick. It was an arrangement that served everyone's interests. Everyone except Graves. Everyone except Graves. Holmes's expression hardened. Graves, who faced legal ruin if Ashcroft survived. Graves, who was present in the house on the night of the death. Graves, who was the last person to see Ashcroft alive, or at least the last to admit it. I believe Graves discovered the plan. How he discovered it, I cannot yet say with certainty, perhaps through Halstead, who was plainly the weakest link in the conspiracy, or perhaps through his own observation of Ashcroft's increasingly unusual behaviour. But discover it he did, and having discovered it, he saw his opportunity. Holmes began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back. Graves did not need to devise a murder. Ashcroft had already devised it for him. All Graves needed to do was ensure that the plan failed at the critical moment, that the accomplice did not arrive, or arrive too late. Now, if Ashcroft was buried alive and the exhumation never took place, the result would be indistinguishable from the plan's intended outcome. Ashcroft would be dead, the death certificate would stand, and no one would ever suspect that a murder had occurred, because the victim had arranged every detail of his own burial. "The perfect crime," I murmured. "A perfect crime built upon a perfect crime," Holmes agreed. Ashcroft designed the mechanism. Graves merely redirected its purpose. He intercepted the communication between Fenwick and the accomplice. Or more likely, he sent his own message to the intermediary in Calais, instructing Pellerin to come on the wrong night or at the wrong hour. When Pellerin heard nothing from the grave, because the altered timing meant Ashcroft had not yet regained consciousness, he left. And the following day, Graves sent the note through Fenwick's office, a note Pellerin believed came from the original client. telling him the plan had changed and that his services were no longer needed. And Ashcroft woke alone. And Ashcroft woke alone, fully conscious, fully strong, because the poison he took was the one he had prepared for himself, carefully measured to wear off within the expected window. He woke in perfect darkness, in a sealed coffin, 6 feet beneath the earth, and he understood at once that he had been betrayed. He clawed at the lid. He scratched 3 letters into the wood, the beginning of the name of the man he believed responsible, and then the air ran out, and there was nothing. The room was silent. The fire crackled softly in the grate. Outside, the evening traffic of Baker Street rumbled on. You were oblivious to the terrible story that had just been assembled within these walls. "Tomorrow," Holmes said at last, "I shall present this reconstruction to Inspector Lestrade and request that warrants be issued for the arrest of Lionel Graves. I shall also recommend that Dr. Halstead be brought in for formal questioning regarding his role in the conspiracy. Fenwick and Lady Margaret present a more delicate problem. Their involvement in the original scheme was criminal, but it was Ashcroft's scheme, not theirs, and their culpability in his death is, at most, indirect." He sank into his chair and closed his eyes. "It is a wretched business, Watson. A man who tried to cheat the world was cheated in turn by the one person he failed to account for. There is a symmetry to it that might almost be called poetic, were it not for the fact that a human being died in the most terrible manner imaginable, alone, in the dark, beneath the weight of the earth he had chosen for himself." Chapter 10. Holmes's final explanation. The arrest of Lionel Graves took place on a cold and windless morning, 4 days after Pellerin's visit to Baker Street. Inspector Lestrade, who had listened to Holmes's reconstruction with a mixture of scepticism and grudging respect that characterized their long professional relationship, had obtained the necessary warrants and dispatched 2 constables to Graves' residence in Belgravia shortly after dawn. Graves, I was later told, received the officers with an expression of bewildered outrage that deteriorated rapidly into silence when the nature of the charges was explained to him. He was taken to Scotland Yard without incident and placed in a holding cell to await formal questioning. Dr. Halstead was brought in the same morning. His arrest, by contrast, was a considerably more agitated affair. The doctor attempted to flee through the rear entrance of his Harley Street practice and was apprehended in the alley behind the building by a constable who had been stationed there at Holmes's suggestion. Halstead was shaking so violently when he was led into the police carriage that the officer was obliged to assist him with the step. Holmes had arranged for the principal figures in the case to be assembled that afternoon in the drawing-room of Ashcroft House, the same room in which we had first met Lady Margaret, Edward and Graves nearly a fortnight earlier. It was an unusual request. N. and Lestrade had agreed to it only after Holmes pointed out, with characteristic precision, that the case as it stood was largely circumstantial, and that a formal presentation of the evidence in the presence of all parties might produce the admissions necessary to secure a conviction. When Holmes and I arrived at 2:30, the room was already occupied. Lady Margaret sat in the same chair she had taken during our first visit, dressed in black, her face pale but composed. Beside her, in a posture of protective attendance, stood Arthur Fenwick, a man I had not previously met, but whose appearance matched the description the servants had provided. He was younger than I had expected, slight of build, with intelligent eyes and a nervous mouth that he kept pressed into a thin line. Edward Ashcroft occupied the far corner of the room, his arms folded across his broad chest, radiating the same impatient hostility he had displayed at our first meeting. Lestrade stood near the door with 2 constables, his notebook open and his pencil ready. Graves and Halstead had been brought from Scotland Yard under escort. Graves sat in a straight-back chair near the window, his face set in an expression of rigid composure that did not quite conceal the fear beneath it. He had aged visibly in the days since I had last seen him. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes shadowed, and his hands lay in his lap with the unnatural stillness of a man exerting considerable effort not to let them tremble. Halstead sat apart from the others, hunched and diminished, staring at the carpet with the vacant gaze of a man who has already accepted that his situation is beyond salvage. Holmes stood before the fireplace. He had not removed his coat, and he held no notes. His manner was calm and unhurried, and when he spoke his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who has arrived at the end of a long journey, and is certain of the ground beneath his feet. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "Some of you have come willingly, others have not, but each of you played a part in the events that led to the death of Sir Reginald Ashcroft, and I believe you are all entitled to hear the truth, the complete truth, before the matter passes into the hands of the law." He paused and looked at each face in turn. "You all believed Sir Reginald Ashcroft to be the victim of a terrible crime, a man buried alive through the negligence of his physician, left to die in the most dreadful circumstances imaginable. London was horrified. The newspapers demanded inquiries. The public mourned a prominent citizen cut down by an unforgivable medical blunder. His gaze settled on the room with an even and implacable calm. In reality, Sir Reginald Ashcroft was not the victim of this crime. He was its architect. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Edward, whose hostility had been a constant throughout our involvement in the case, went still. Over the course of several months, Holmes continued, Sir Reginald Ashcroft devised and prepared a plan of extraordinary ambition. He intended to fake his own death, be buried, be secretly exhumed by an accomplice, and flee England to begin a new life in France, taking with him a fortune he had covertly transferred to foreign accounts. The plan required a paralytic substance capable of producing a convincing simulation of death, a physician willing to certify that simulation as genuine, and a trusted agent willing to dig up the coffin after burial. He turned to Halstead. "Dr. Halstead, you were aware of Sir Reginald's research into paralytic toxins. You corresponded with him on the subject. And on the night of his supposed death, you conducted an examination so cursory that it would not have detected life in a man whose heart was still beating. You declared him dead within minutes, without using a stethoscope, without checking for pupillary response, without any of the standard measures a competent physician would employ. You did this because you had been paid to do it, paid handsomely in advance, for a service that you knew to be fraudulent." Halstead did not look up. His shoulders trembled and a sound escaped him, a low, strangled noise that might have been a sob, or might have been an attempt to speak that died before it reached his lips. "You were the weakest point in Ashcroft's scheme," Holmes said, not unkindly. "A man of limited courage enlisted in a conspiracy that required nerves of steel. I do not believe you understood the full scope of Ashcroft's plan. I believe you were told only that you would be required to certify a death that was not genuine, and that the gentleman in question would recover in due course. You did not ask questions because the money was good, and because Ashcroft was a man accustomed to being obeyed." He turned next to Lady Margaret and Fenwick. "Lady Ashcroft, Mr. Fenwick, now your roles in this scheme were not those of its designers but of its beneficiaries. Lady Ashcroft, you were aware of your husband's intention to disappear. The arrangement suited you admirably. With Sir Reginald declared dead, you would inherit his English estate, free to live as you chose and with whom you chose. Mr. Fenwick, you served as the intermediary between Ashcroft's plan and its execution abroad. It was through your office that a French agent named Vincent Lebar was engaged to recruit an accomplice in Calais, a man named Pellerin, who was hired to exhume the coffin on the night following the burial." Lady Margaret's composure did not break, but I saw her hands tighten in her lap. Fenwick placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture that was at once protective and revealing. "I do not believe either of you intended Sir Reginald's death," Holmes said. You participated in a fraud, not a murder. The distinction is important, and I trust the courts will recognize it." He paused. The room was very still. Then he turned to face Graves, and something in his manner shifted. A hardening of the jaw, a narrowing of the eyes that I'd seen only in the presence of those whom Holmes judged to have committed acts of genuine and deliberate cruelty. "Mr. Graves, you are the reason Sir Reginald Ashcroft is dead." Graves did not move. His eyes, fixed on Holmes, were wide and glassy, and the rigid composure he had maintained since his arrival was beginning to fracture at its edges. "You discovered Ashcroft's plan. I believe you extracted the details from Dr. Halstead, whose nerve had already begun to fail him, and who could not withstand sustained pressure from a man as desperate as yourself. You learned that Ashcroft intended to be buried alive and exhumed. You learned the identity of the intermediary and the means by which the accomplice would be contacted. And you understood, with the clarity of a man facing ruin, that Ashcroft's plan offered you something you could obtain in no other way: an escape." Holmes stepped closer to Graves. "If Ashcroft disappeared to France, the fraud at the Continental Trading Company would be exposed. Ashcroft's solicitors would pursue the legal action he had threatened, and you would be destroyed. But if Ashcroft died, truly died, the threat died with him. The partnership agreement would transfer the company's assets to you. The books could be quietly rewritten. The debts could be restructured or concealed. You would survive. You did not need to invent a murder, Mr. Graves. Ashcroft had already provided the mechanism. All you needed to do was ensure that the exhumation never took place. You intercepted the communication between Fenwick's office and the accomplice in Calais. You sent a message, through channels you had learned from Halstead, instructing Pellerin to arrive at the cemetery at the wrong hour, before Ashcroft had regained consciousness. When Pellerin heard nothing from the grave and sent word asking for instructions, you replied through Fenwick's office, posing as the original client, and told him that the plan had changed. You paid him his remaining fee and sent him back to France, and then you waited. Holmes's voice dropped. You waited while Sir Reginald Ashcroft woke in the darkness of his own coffin. You waited while he clawed at the lid above him until his fingers were torn and bloodied. You waited while he scratched the first 3 letters of your name into the wood beneath the lining. A final, desperate accusation that he must have known no one would ever see. And you waited while the air ran out and the knocking stopped and the silence of the grave became permanent. Graves broke. It was not dramatic. There was no outburst, no protestation, no theatrical collapse. He simply closed his eyes, and the rigid mask of his composure fell away, and what remained was the face of a man who had been carrying the knowledge of what he had done and could carry it no longer. "I did not mean for it to happen that way," he said, and his voice was barely a whisper. I only needed time. If he had gone to France, I would have been finished. Everything I had built, everything I had worked for, gone. I thought if the plan simply failed, he would wake up, they would dig him out eventually, and he would not have reported the failure, Holmes finished for him, because to do so would have exposed his own fraud. You counted on his silence, but you miscalculated. The plan did not merely fail, it succeeded too well. Ashcroft was buried, the accomplice was turned away, and no one came. Graves said nothing more. He sat with his eyes closed and his hands open in his lap, and the room was silent around him. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, I believe you have heard sufficient to proceed. The charges against Mr. Graves should include, at minimum, conspiracy to commit murder, and the willful obstruction of a planned rescue that resulted in death. Dr. Halstead should be charged as an accessory to fraud, and questioned further regarding his role in the conspiracy. Lady Ashcroft and Mr. Fenwick were participants in the original scheme, but not in its subversion. I leave their disposition to your judgment and that of the Crown Prosecutor." Lestrade nodded and motioned to his constables. Graves was led from the room without resistance. Halstead followed, weeping openly. Lady Margaret watched them go with an expression that I could not quite identify. Not grief, not relief, but something caught between the two, like a woman standing on the shore of a country she would never see again. Holmes and I departed Ashcroft House for the last time as the afternoon light was fading. Here we walked in silence for some distance before I spoke. "It is a terrible story, Holmes." "It is," he agreed. "A man clever enough to deceive the world, yet not clever enough to foresee that his own deception could be turned against him. There is a lesson in that, Watson, though I confess it is not a comfortable one." "And the accomplice? Pellerin? What becomes of him?" "He will be questioned, but I doubt he will face serious charges. He was a tool, not an agent. He did not know the full nature of the scheme, and he acted in good faith, or at least in the faith that passes for good among men who dig up coffins for a living." We reached Baker Street as the lamps were being lit. Holmes paused at the door and looked up at the windows of our sitting room, where the firelight flickered behind the curtain. "There is one detail that will stay with me, Watson, long after the rest of this case has faded from memory. Those 3 letters scratched into the wood of the coffin. G.R.A. The beginning of an accusation that was never finished. Ashcroft knew, in his final moments, who had betrayed him. He knew, and he tried to tell us, and he very nearly succeeded." He pushed open the door and stepped inside. "Write it up, Watson. Write all of it. The world should know how Sir Reginald Ashcroft died. Not because the story is pleasant, but because the truth, however dark, is always preferable to the comfortable fiction that conceals it." I did write it. I wrote every word, from the terrified caretaker on our doorstep to the broken man led away in silence. And as I set down my pen on the final page, I found myself returning, as I so often did, to a single image, the image of a coffin lid, scratched and gouged and marked with 3 unfinished letters, buried in the earth of Highgate Cemetery, like a message in a bottle that was never meant to be found. Thus ended the strange and harrowing case of the man who was buried alive, a man who had devised the perfect crime only to become its perfect victim. And if there is a moral to be drawn from his fate, it is perhaps this, that the grave a man digs for others may, in the end, be the one that swallows him whole.